Okay, I've had this Bartel Starwood for quite a long time now, and I've been thinking, is it the perfect amp for Strat players? It's got a lot of different sounds in it, a lot of sounds that a Strat player will find absolutely perfect for them, useful, and yeah, in this video we're going to go through some different types of sounds, some 60s, some 50s, some Marshall-y types. And in fact, nearer the end of the video, you're going to hear some sounds that really surprised me because I've not spent a lot of time with them. But actually, some of the sounds that I didn't think were that useful when I first got the amp, now that I use them more, I think Mark Bartel does know what he's talking about. The Strat today is this Fender custom shop. It's a master built by Ron Thorne, and it's a 50s type. It has JW restoration pickups in, and yeah, it's a pretty classic sounding 50s style Strat. So I'm going to show you the clean tones in this and the overdriven tones and with an overdrive pedal. So we're going to start with the cleanest. And in fact, that's what you heard at the beginning there. That's what Mark Bartel calls the 60s clean. Now, a very quick rundown of this amp if you don't know how it works. I've got a video about that, which I'll put in the description, that's longer, but very briefly. It's not your normal EQ like on a normal amp. Turning the treble doesn't just increase or decrease the treble, and same for the bass. They actually interact with the amount of gain in the amp and the mid-range, and each of the treble and bass knobs also interacts with the other bass and treble. So you get a blackface Fender sound, a tweed Fender sound, a Marshall-y sound out of this amp because of the way it affects the EQ. So the 60s clean tone is essentially, let's put it like a super reverb. You know, it's a mid-60s blackface clean sound. So as you'll see in the B-roll here, the 60s clean tone, the cleanest tone you can get on this amp, is set by putting the preamp volume at about 3 or 3.5, and then putting the treble and bass on max, and that completely scoops the mids. Then I've got the reverb set the way it'll be set for most of the video, and then you need to put the master on 10 for this particular setting. If I was in the tweed setting, and added a bit more gain, then I could turn the master down. This is not the loudest amp in some situations. Like in this clean setting, it's not that loud. Probably loud enough for most people's like home settings, but for gigging, it's not that loud. Now what I want to show you here is a couple of nuances that you can have. So there is a bright switch where you pull up the preamp volume and that adds a bright switch. And then there's another setting which he calls 60s clean tone 2, and it's just a much less scooped version. So you roll the treble and the bass down to 6.5, and that sort of adds a bit more mids back in, but it doesn't go completely tweedy. And this is actually my favorite setting, or one of my two favorite settings on this amp. So I want you to hear back to back the normal clean tone, the clean tone with the bright switch, the less scooped clean tone, and the less scooped clean tone with a bright switch. Because the less scooped clean tone can be a little bit darker. So you'll then hear that the bright switch affects that more. Okay, this will get more clear as we go along. So to me, between the normal clean tone, the clean tone with the bright switch, the less scooped clean tone, and the less scooped clean tone with a bright switch, and the few tones in between that I'm not showing you in this because they're just very nuanced, there's plenty you can get out of this in the vein of a Fender mid-60s blackface. So yeah, love that. Now you're just going to hear the less scooped clean tone just with a few of the pickup positions for a minute. Okay, one of my favourite pedals to use with a Strat when it comes to overdrive is the Kingtone Blues Power. Kingtone pedals often really feel like they're made for Strats, especially the Blues Power when you put it on this glass setting. So we're going to hear the 60s clean tone with the Blues Power and the 60s less scooped clean tone with the Blues Power. Yeah. So look, if you love that whole glassy Strat thing, you'll love this. The way it feels, it's yeah, it's sort of edgy to play, right? There's not a lot of saturation, so you dig in, it blooms for a second, it goes back down. It's very dynamic. It really relies on you. Not to say that it feels sterile. This amp never really feels sterile, maybe at the absolute cleanest setting, like any amp would. You know, it's not giving you a lot. But once you dig in and once you put a pedal like this in front, it's just absolutely brilliant. So, you know, if you like those mid-60s clean tones, but you don't want to have an amp dedicated to that because you really want a great Tweed amp, for example, this amp can give you that. And we haven't even really hit on what this amp is at its best at for most guitars. I do think for Strats that its best tones are those 60s ones. Later in the video, we're going to come back to the 60s tone with a bit more drive in it. But for now, we're going to hear the Tweed tone, so you can hear how it compares. So to get into the Tweed, we turn the treble and bass just down a little bit further, increasing those mids a bit more, which gives it a bit more warmth and a bit more of that bloom. It rolls back at the top end a bit more. And let's hear that clean. So listening back to that Tweed clean, I thought, although I think Strat and Blackface just goes together so well, there's something that tells me this amp is happiest in its Tweed setting. It's so solid feeling. There's more saturation, but it's not really that saturated, but it just feels great under the fingers. It's easy to play. So I do often just keep this amp in one setting, and I do change the gain from being clean to being overdriven. And actually that's what you're going to hear now, the Tweed overdriven sound. So it's not a huge amount of gain. I'd say it's true to Tweed amps. I mean, you could really get this to sort of fart out, you know, if you whacked that preamp gain all the way up. But it can also get loud at this point. Only really with the treble and bass on 10 and 10, so the most Blackface setting, is the volume a little bit limited. Otherwise, it is a pretty standard 28 watt loudness. But again, there's something that makes you want to dig in with this Tweed. It feels solid, enough saturation and sustain. It just sounds great. It blooms, you know, it's warm. So this amp, it's the home for this amp, I would say, this sort of Tweed overdrive sound. Okay, let's hear the Tweed overdrive now with the blues power in front of it. And I've got to say, this sort of feeling and sound is massively addicting. now I want to, and I mentioned this earlier in a video, put it back to that 60s scooped blackface sound, but whack the overdrive up to about 7 and hear what that sounds like, and then change the EQ so that it's the less scooped version of that 60s sound, but with the overdrive. And I think that's a great place to be on this amp. It adds a bit of saturation under the fingers, or sustain should I say, but still feels like the classic 60s thing. Okay, now let's put the blues power in front of that less scooped 60s overdriven sound. And I think this is a very happy place for a Strat to be. It's not so scooped that it's going to get lost all the time. It's got enough under the fingers with that bit of extra overdrive in the amp, and then add the Glassy blues power on top, and you've got a very classic Strat sound to me, and one that you could do whole blues gigs with. Yeah. Okay, at the beginning of the video, I said there's a sound in here that surprised me actually now. I haven't spent a lot of time with this amp in its sort of more Marshall setting. And in order to do that, you put the treble around 5 and you take the bass all the way out. There are various ways to set it depending on what sort of Marshall-y sound, but this is like the Plexi overdrive sound. So the preamp will be on 7. Now, in this little demo here, I've kept all my little mistakes and fluffs and pauses in just to show you that this is suddenly a much more brittle, Marshall-y feel to it, more direct, very different under the fingers. And it took me a minute to get used to it. And I also turned the reverb down from the previous because I think it just fits the situation better. Okay, so whilst that is harder to play, you do get used to it, and it does feel and sound in the recording quite a lot like that sort of Plexi sound. So I really quite enjoy it. I mean, it's not the most versatile thing in its Marshall setting. I wouldn't buy this if I thought I'm buying a Marshall type amp. I'm buying this for the Tweeds and the 60s stuff. And then this Marshall thing is very passable, great in a pinch. And if you had no other amp to record with even, you could do it. It does sound authentic. There's not a lot you can do with the EQ once you're in that setting. But now I wanted to have a bit more fun with it and whack the preamp from 7 to 8.5. And actually this became easier to play, more saturated as well. Let's hear that. So yeah, that's fun. That felt like putting a boost pedal in front of the whole thing. So I think I might use it like that more. And then lastly, I wanted to just fill out the bass a little bit. So I put the bass up to 2 again. It's not a huge difference, just a little bit in the feel of the playing and bolstering that sound. So let's hear that. Okay, so that's my Strat demo for this amp, the Bartel Starwood, an amp I've now had for quite a long time. I absolutely love it. I'm not sure it will ever go anywhere. It's a masterpiece, if I'm honest. It can do things that the best of their type can basically do, you know. So, okay, if you love 60s clean sounds and that's all you want, buy a Super Reverb. If you love 50s Tweed Deluxes or whatever, go and buy one of those. If you're a Marshall fanatic, get a Marshall or a Friedman. But if you want an amp that can do all of those things, some of them incredibly well, as well as or better than the original in a way, that is a take it anywhere amp with amazing quality. The reverb is astounding. If you enjoy the fact that someone has made this from scratch, one man making the hardwood cabinets and baffles, doing the tweed covering himself, the incredibly beautifully hand-wired chassis, the design in itself just absolutely fantastic. He's a complete genius in my opinion. Then the Bartel Starwood is something for that. It can be a living room amp. It could be an amazing recording amp. It can be a gigging amp. It's beautiful to look at. It's beautiful to hear in the room. I'm always happy when I turn this amp on, which is why recently I've not been using anything else. Right, there's one last clip to play out with, but I hope you've enjoyed this, and let me know what you think down in the comments about me doing this for different types of guitars. All right, cheers.